I'm Richard Lyle, President of the British Chamber of Commerce. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the event this morning. I think we're a beautiful event, beautiful room here today for the talk today.
So just like to sort of kick things off with a bit of an introduction to the speakers and the theme. So obviously this is, redefining the workplace, and today specifically talking about office space in Tokyo. So in preparing for this event, I was actually thinking about my own office, or the office I work in, and how pre-pandemic and post-pandemic things have changed. So the first thing to say is that I'm not wearing a tie today because I'm so used to being at home and not wearing ties anymore. I can't remember where my tie is, so I'm looking quite casual today. And I think the second thing to say is when we canvassed our staff about what they wanted to change in our office, one comment sort of really struck me. One of my colleagues just said, we're a business development consultancy, so we spend a lot of time on the road out meeting clients, but obviously we need to engage with our colleagues to sort of brainstorm and move stuff forward. So one of my colleagues said, I want the office to be a club, a place where I can come and meet my colleagues, interact with them, have a good time with those colleagues, but work hard and learn new stuff. So that really struck me as something to think about, perhaps for our speakers today. Anyway, today we have JLL, three speakers from JLL giving the presentations. We have three great speakers. So the presentation is roughly split into three different areas, talking about some research findings about how the market is changing, then a part about sort of the design of office or redesign of office, and then the final part about the Tokyo office market and how that's changing. So we have three great speakers today from JLL. So we have John Cook, the Executive Director. As I was speaking to him earlier, he's spent 11 years in Japan, but prior to that, other postings in Asia. So he's got a long career working in consulting with clients and making their spaces the best space possible. We have Joris Berkhout, a director who has over 10 years of experience in the real estate industry. And then we have Rie Osugi, a director, and speaking to her, she's, I think, recently come to JLL, but she comes from a customer perspective, so understanding customer needs in office spaces. So I think her role at JLL is to tell JLL how the customers want to, what the customers need out of their office space. So we have three great speakers today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome John to the stage just to kick things off. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Richard, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I just wanted to kick things off with a brief intro to JLL, who don't know us so well. We're an international real estate firm, and we actually operate in 80 countries and have 90,000 employees. But in Japan, we've been operating for 35 years and have 1,000 employees, or just over. And we operate out of Tokyo, Osaka, and we recently opened an office in Fukuoka. As you can see from the slide here, we interact with our owner, investor, and occupier clients at all stages of the real estate cycle. So from research and strategic consulting, in terms of identifying the optimal real estate solution, through to assisting with a transaction, be it a building purchase or a new lease, through to managing design and construction of new facilities, and then managing those facilities, be it from a facility management or property management perspective, and then full cycle assisting with exit strategies in terms of whether it's a building disposal, a lease renewal, or a relocation. And underpinned, we have a strong JLL technologies and sustainability team supporting those initiatives. But today, as Richard mentioned, we want to kick off with some of the latest research in the hybrid working trend. And Rie Osugi, my colleague, will walk you through some of these latest trends. Thanks.
So I'd like to start sharing our latest research with outcome especially the research called Workforce Preference Barometer. This is a series of the research over a few years, and especially the focus on to understand how employee office workers feel about the hybrid work, work from home, and office work. And also the research team has been trying to understand the priorities change for the office workers this year. And so this research has been conducted with 4,000 office workers globally and across 10 countries, including Japan. So where are we now is the right-hand side. So hybrid work is, our research team has thinking that it's reached the optimal point. When you look at the graph here, so this is over 3 years trends, showing that from October 2020 to April 2022. So the gray line showing the people expecting to adopt hybrid, and the red line showing the people working actually hybrid mode today. So gradually the gap between is smaller, and now this year 60% of office workers wants to work in hybrid style, and 50% are already doing so. So we think this is already an optimal point, and the hybrid work has become the most popular way of working today, and we believe here's to stay. So when we look at what actually the companies are doing, this is the data from the last year. So you may see some changes already. However, as you can see, this spectrum is showing from 100% office on your left, and 100% remote on your right, and hybrid model in the middle. So each company has their own direction. And the key message here is the company's direction is really diverse. So it's not the same. So for example, the technology company like Salesforce and Google, Facebook, Twitter, they are in a rather remote first hybrid, or sometimes 100% remote. However, when we look at the financial firms, like Goldman Sachs, Barclays, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, they are announcing that they need to bring people back to the office, 100% office or office first hybrid. However, when we look at the city, they are on a hybrid model, and also even UBS, they are in a remote first hybrid category. So we cannot say that financial firms are office centric anymore. So each company, each organization has their own view and their own strategy regarding the workplace concept. So from here, I try to share some of the priority changes. So the employee priority has been changing a lot over the pandemic period. And this showing that the before pandemic to the April 2020, the trends of each of the section choices. So you can see the quality life is used to be second brand. However, after pandemic, it's always on the first priority for office workers. And at the end, on the other hand, the black line, the salary preference, it's used to be first ranking. However, it's now third ranked. And the biggest change we have been seeing is the red line, health and well-being. The Chamber of Commerce had a well-being event before. How people are considering their health and mental and physical and well-being a lot these days. So office workers are taking the company must or should taking care of their quality of life and also the health and well-being now. The second point I would like to share today is the flexibility. So because of the quality of life preference and the priority, so people started thinking their flexibility. So this is the choice of flexibility we are researched. So the biggest, most preferable flexibility from the office workers was the flexible working hours and flexible working week. For example, the 4-day working per week. So those are the message from the office workers, and you can see the gray bar is explaining how employee current support, and the purple line is the expectation, and that percent, the figure 21%, 27 is the gap point between. So there's still a gap. And even companies are trying to provide some flexibility to the employees. However, many people think it's not enough. And it comes to the right-hand side, like 3 in 4 employees would reconsider their involvement with their company because they want to have a greater flexibility and more quality time with their family or for personal pursuit. And not only from the JL research, we've reviewed the other research as well. And for example, the LinkedIn Global Talent Trend research also said that salary is not the priority anymore. And so people prefer a quality of life, flexibility, well-being more prioritized when they choose working place. So enabling hybrid work shows your people that you are flexible or empathetic employer or not. It's a very hot topic for office workers right now. Maybe everyone might think about the recent comment from Elon Musk and how its impact on our company. We don't know yet, but we think that we have to consider office workers carefully. The third one is about the office environment. So social interactions are still very required from office workers. That's what we confirmed. And the face-to-face collaboration is an aspect of office life, which is missed by the same proportion of respondents as 2021, despite people being able to return to the office more often. So when you look at the left-hand side, 50% of office workers still miss social interaction, 44% miss common understanding and bonding. So people are still missing the socialization, and we believe that the office environment or the office space or the programs relating to the office would bring people back to the office in a very a social way. Richard said, a club would be a really good idea to bring people back. And also, hybrid work also raised a renewed collaboration challenge for workplace, design and the new in-office technology. So 60% of employees displaying the appetite for new in-office collaboration technologies, while only 38% of their employer provided. So actually, maybe the reason people are not coming back so much yet is the office is still stayed as before the pandemic. It's not supporting how people work anymore. So the office design or the technology or the program must be reconsidered to fit with their needs. So the long-term success of hybrid work will rely on a holistic approach to performance and the value creation. So as we shared, so that the directions and how we support office workers are different from company to company, or sometimes from team to team, or from person to person. So it's really required to communicating with office workers, employees, and sending a right message in a very nice, mutual understanding. That's the key things. So from here, I'm going over to John, and he's explaining more.
Yeah, so taking that research into account, what are we seeing happening in the world of actual office design? We tried to distill this into sort of 4 key takeaways that Rie just mentioned. So in terms of flexibility, we're seeing a number of clients who, first of all, at a macro level, just trying to understand and define what is the best mix or blend for their workplace. You know, what is conventional space, what is potentially third-party space outside the office, and what is their work-from-home policy. What we've seen as a general trend over the past 2 years is that many multinationals, in response to that and low utilization levels, have given back 20 to 30% of office space. And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of the impact on the market in general. Also, flexibility in terms of the space that's left behind. There's a big focus on, given the high construction costs in Japan, how can spaces become more flexible and less rigid and adapt to different needs when people come into the office. And we're seeing the furniture industry drive a lot of this trend in terms of new products, movable partitions, movable technology, modular furniture, etc. So it's very much kind of looking at how the space can be adapted as you go forward. The second point on wellness, as we've seen, that's a really key point that's picked up in the research. So we've seen a number of companies, for example, installing like indoor air quality sensors, a big focus on general kind of well-being and cleanliness in the office, and a number of organizations looking to achieve WELL accreditation, which is the US government initiative also related to the LEED certification, the sustainability certification. Also, very much a focus on how spaces are curated and how, overtly recognize cleaning regimes. We see people like WeWork, for example, establish new sets of protocols and guidelines who do this really well. So I think when people come back to the office, they want to know that it's clean, hygienic, and well maintained. And again, going back to the club analogy, how from maybe more of a hospitality perspective, these spaces are run. From a technology will enable some of these decisions. What we're also seeing is a number of companies installing utilization sensors. So this is an extract from VergeSense, which is a popular sensor in the market. So at any one time, an organization can see how many people are in their office, and they can play that back to their employees via apps to see before they come in how busy it is, or when they do come in, which space can they go to enable them to work in an appropriately socially distanced environment. And we're also seeing a big uptake in the increase of audio-visual technology, particularly more immersive experiences to cope with hybrid meetings. So hello, hybrid joiners. I hope it's working for you. So this is a really important trend, and so we're seeing people spending money on that. Also, in terms of because spaces are basically getting smaller, occupiers, however, are looking at what can my landlord or developer give to me that I don't have to replicate in my own space. So buildings, indeed this building and many new developments, that can offer things like childcare facilities, gyms, great food and beverage offerings that really help supplement what's already in the tenant space. But also importantly, kind of pay-as-you-go meeting facilities. So for things like client events and training seminars. A lot of offices, have been in the market a long time, have huge spaces that are used maybe 2 or 3 times a year, and the rest of the time they just sit there empty. And that's an expensive thing to do in a market like Tokyo. So we're seeing that as a trend, and I think Joris will pick up on that a little bit later. What I'd like to show you now is a brief video from our Singapore office, which basically they've introduced a number of the elements I've just described, and so you can see how it actually happens in reality. And we're looking to do the same in our new Tokyo office when we relocate in November. So here comes the technology piece. Sort of in the 20th century, we saw spaces very much as kind of dedicated spaces. You had an assigned workstation, your manager usually had an office, you had meeting rooms, etc. What we saw in the first 2 decades, pre-COVID of this century, was a number of organizations moving towards what we call activity-based working, or ABW, which provided a more variety of settings and often and usually accompanied by desk sharing or kind of unassigned situations. So already organizations were looking at kind of optimizing their footprint and getting more people into the same space. So what we've seen kind of post-COVID, or hopefully as we come out of it, is that a number of those spaces were already being kind of already designed to meet some of those requirements of the COVID era. And I guess one of the bigger changes we've seen is a kind of a bigger percentage of the spaces being dedicated to community space, picking up again on the club idea that when you come to the office, you want to kind of interact with colleagues. But anyway, that trend in terms of space reduction is something I'd now like to pass over to Joris to explain a little bit more about, what is the impact on the overall Tokyo office market, and indeed what can you expect to be paying for your rent in the next few years, as I'm sure you'll all be interested to hear. So at that point, I'll hand over to Joris Berkhout. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. And yes, indeed, that's the question that a lot of people have been wondering about ever since COVID started. So how is this going to play out, and what's it going to mean for the future of the office market? So let's start by having a look at the long-term supply and demand chart for office space. So what we see here, we're looking at grade A office space in Tokyo. That basically means those larger scale, newer, big office buildings. So it doesn't include sort of nationwide or smaller buildings. And we see in red here something which we call the vacancy rate. That's how much those offices are occupied. And we see that there was a huge spike. So a lot of offices were vacated at the Lehman shock or the global financial crisis. And after that, we had sort of a 10-year period during which we were all talking about Abenomics and work style reforms, Hataraki Kata Kaikaku. I think we had a couple of BCCJ events back then as well. And as you can see, that corresponded with a huge decline in the vacancy rate. So there was an incredible demand for office space, despite quite a lot of new buildings being built, because these great bars, those actually mean how many new square meters of office space are being added to the market each year. So that was really a lot of demand for quality office space that we saw back then. And we hit a very low, almost zero vacancy rate just before the start of COVID. Now that has definitely changed. We can clearly see that purely as a result of people handing back space, the vacancy rate has spiked up to 3.5%. And there is actually barely been new buildings last year and this year. So it's really a result of people handing back the space. That's, I think, a very powerful sign. And as you can see, we expect a bit of stabilization this year on the longer term, as there will be more new buildings, and I'll speak about them a bit more later on. In 2023, 2025, that vacancy rate is going up more, and it's definitely going to be a much more tenant-friendly market, which is really a shift from what we've seen in the last 10, 12 years. However, at the same time, we have seen something interesting happen, really maybe the last half year. Actually, the vacancy rate as of now has declined in the last couple months to 3%. So there's been an uptick in demand, and this is very interesting. And I'll go a bit more into sort of explaining the reasons behind this. But what it really comes down to is that, 2.5 years into COVID, companies have figured out, okay, we can reduce our office space. But right now, on top of everyone's mind is really like, how do we attract our employees back, if only for a couple of days a week, to the office? And as Rie has shown, people expect a lot more from their workplace. And companies are implementing new designs and club-like models within their own spaces, and they also seek that kind of quality from the building they're in. So people no longer want to be in an older office building, further from the station, less attractive. And because they can reduce their size, it actually makes it possible to relocate to better quality buildings. And that's really, we've seen a couple of relocations happening the last couple of months that really take advantage of that. And that explains the uptick in demand that we've seen very recently. So next, the big question is, how does this all relate to the rental levels? So let's have a look at the rental chart. So here in red, you can still see the same vacancy rates, and now I've plotted in blue, so the average grade A rent in Tokyo overall. And you can see it's a very nice inverse relationship. So the high vacancy rates mean that rents will be going down. And we also see that that period of sort of growth pre-COVID, those 10 years corresponded with an increase in rental rates. And just at the peak of the market, 2019, the average for grade A space was about 40,000 yen per tsubo, which is the average benchmark that people use in Japan for office space. Now, since then, we've seen together with the rise in vacancy rates, we've seen a decline in rents, about 10% since then, which is definitely significant. However, if we look sort of going forward, we do see some further declines in the rent levels, but the market is not going off the cliff. It's not completely collapsing, and that is what some people were, of course, thinking about. And then that's not what we see happening. So I'll explain a little bit more about why that is, and there's a couple of reasons. So first of all, unfortunately for many tenants, rents are easier to go up than they go down. So landlords always, they're easy to ask for increases, but rather than decreases, they'll try to offer more one-time sort of incentives and free rent and other benefits to tenants. And we can here see, in quite small on the left-hand side, the number of free rent months for the average contract being signed has been increasing a lot in recent years. So that's one thing. And we don't see that figure back in sort of in the face rents that we see in the chart, but it does have an impact. Secondly, so the peak we had in 2019 was historically not as high as, say, for example, what we saw in 2006 when people were paying well above 50,000 yen per tsubo for an average office space, grade A in Tokyo. So there was it was less, maybe say, bubbly kind of peak, and there was less scope for rents to decline further before they hit sort of a stable level and actually demand increases. Because that's really the third thing, and that's the most important, what we've seen happening, is the increase in demand that I explained from people looking for quality office space has been accompanied by this sort of 10% decrease. Landlords are very eager to provide incentives and lure tenants to their new buildings. Suddenly, a lot of relocations plans that were not really feasible before have become feasible, and we've seen them being implemented in the last couple of months. So overall, we do expect a tenant-friendly market, but quite stable. This story is further supported if we have a quick look and take a detour on the sort of the global office markets. So here we see relatively plotted the 5 major office markets. And I see the colors have changed a bit actually, but so it's all relatively compared. And let's focus on sort of the latter part of the chart where we see what happened after COVID. So if we go from the top, so we see the major Western markets, London, New York, actually rental rates there have barely changed. On the other hand, we see Hong Kong has declined a lot, but that was happening before COVID, and there's a lot of reasons behind that. And finally, at the bottom of the chart, we see Tokyo and also Singapore, which both started declining after COVID, as we've seen in the previous charts. However, in the case of Singapore, the recovery has already started, and rents are more or less back where they used to be. So it really shows that Tokyo is actually performing quite bad, and it's quite reasonable to expect that Tokyo will stabilize going forward as well. However, so far I've been really talking about averages and average numbers, and they do hide a very important aspect of the market going forward. And we see that if we, for example, look at the different submarkets of Tokyo and how the vacancy rates behave over there. So we all know Tokyo, we have Marunouchi, Shibuya, Shinjuku, Toranomon, where we are right now. There's many different office markets over here. And before COVID, the vacancy rates were uniformly low. It was very hard to find an office space, well, basically anywhere. Whether it was in Shinjuku or in Marunouchi. However, after COVID, tenants have more choice, and we really see that. And there are certain submarkets where the vacancy rates are well above 6-7%, whereas others are performing quite strongly, and we don't really see much vacancy. It's maybe around 1-2%. So that's really a key feature of the market going forward, and that's the people have more choice. And actually, these submarkets averages, they still hide big differences really on the individual building level. For example, we can see Toranomon and Shiodome there. The Toranomon area where we're now is doing relatively fine actually. There's quite a lot of demand for the new office buildings over here. This is being caused by a couple buildings in the Shiodome area which are really struggling, have been empty for more than a year and barely any tenants signing up. And we do see the same thing, for example, in parts of the Shinagawa market where buildings are really struggling. And that is, as I said, really a key feature where popular buildings remain very popular and others much less so. And that discrepancy or that divergence is only going to be increased more if we sort of look at the new supply of office buildings being built and being created, because that's all high quality space coming on the market. So let's have a quick look at what kind of buildings are being developed and built in the coming years. So first of all, this year there will be one big large-scale new building just on the Yaesu side of Tokyo Station. It's a new building in the Midtown series by Mitsui Fudosan, will be completed in August of this year. And next year, we're going to see a huge supply of new buildings, and the colors are a bit off here, I see, but especially 2023, this area around here, Toranomon, will see many new buildings. I'm sure you've all seen the huge Azabudai redevelopment, number 2 on the chart. Actually, the size of the circle sort of indicates the scale of the building, and this is about 1.5 times Roppongi Hills coming on the market. So it's a huge building, and there's many, many more, including near the Tamachi and Mita areas of Tokyo. Then on the bit longer term, so 2025, 2026, 7, we see a lot more buildings as well. And these are all being planned. Maybe construction hasn't started yet, but the planning phase is done and the ground is being prepared. So we'll see down in Shinagawa, we have 2 huge new buildings near the new Takanawa Gateway Station. Also, if we go further up, north of Tokyo Station, Mitsubishi Estate will be building their huge new Torch Tower. It's the biggest building in Japan, 2027 completion. There was a bit of news that some of those office floors were being turned into residentials, but that's really a tiny part. And still, as for the office space, it will be a huge building, again, maybe about 1.5 times Roppongi Hills. So that's a lot of space. And then on the very long term, so after that, so these are still quite vague and the plannings are still being done. We will see further redevelopments around the Imperial Hotel. The Hibiya area will be completely rebuilt and have a large office component as well. And also we'll see further new buildings in the Yaesu side of Tokyo Station. And finally, 1 new building in Shinjuku as well, which is really the exception because by far the big new real estate developments, as you can see here, will be taking place in the corridor from, say, Tokyo Station, down to Toranomon, and then the Tamachi Shinagawa area. So that's really where a lot of the action is going to be happening going forward. Now, without going into too much detail, let's have a quick look at what are those developers doing and how are they responding to these new needs that tenants really have in the hybrid working market and post-COVID. So it's really about 3 items that were very much topics before COVID as well, but it's only been reinforced. And one is, and we've spoken about this a lot, is the amenities and the well-being. Tenants try to create those facilities within their own office space, and the owners are really outcompeting themselves on providing amenities and spas, employee lounges, and shared facilities within their buildings as well. Finally, we see also flexibility. Now, the average office lease remains fairly inflexible, but we have seen a few developments here. For example, tenants being able to take over existing layouts of other tenants. That was something that was not happening in the market before at all. And we've seen a couple of cases, which, because it's much less capex, makes the whole relocation and your stay in the building a lot more flexible. As Rie showed, there's a demand for employees to work from other locations than home and the office. And we've seen developers and co-working operators sort of provide those third location spaces for people to work. Also, as John was saying, developers are creating common spaces in their buildings, meeting rooms and facilities that people don't have to build in their own office space, but they can use on a shared basis. So this is very interesting to see. And some companies have actually put their entire headquarters within a co-working facility, which is, again, a very new thing that we've seen happening post-COVID. And finally, and probably most importantly, is really sustainability. This was a topic where Japan was, in all honesty, lagging behind quite a bit. Just as recently as a couple of years ago, we could see brochures for major new buildings without a single word on the environmental performance. Now, that's definitely changed, and all big developers are now, this is a serious topic they're looking at. They are getting their accreditations, they're implementing various measures, they're providing green energy, and this is really a change in the market. And it's because tenants demand it. It's part of their location strategy. They need to be in a building that meets their own sustainability goals. And also, from the investor side, developers feel pressure because nobody wants to own a building that is not sustainable on the longer term. So here below, without going into too much detail, I've put sort of 4 of the key new buildings that will be developed in the coming years. So on the left-hand side, we see that Yaesu project that's being built near to Tokyo Station and will be completed in August. That will have a co-working facility operated by the landlord Mitsui Fudosan, and it has all the amenities that employees need. Also, we see the Azabudai building here that will be completed March of next year. Very nearby this very area. The building is topped out right now, and it will have a beautiful British designed, actually, open green spaces around it. The British School will be there, and they'll get a LEED certification for the entire urban development of this building. And finally, next one, also for next year, the Mita redevelopment by Sumitomo Fudosan coming online next year as well. And they're putting a lot of effort throughout their whole office portfolio in really making sure it is sustainable. They'll be providing green energy to the tenants and also seek to be getting various certifications for this building. And finally, it's a bit longer term, but I'm personally quite interested in this building. We will see a wooden skyscraper being built in Nihonbashi, and I think that's going to be very interesting to see as well. So it shows that developers are very much taking this seriously. So it sounds like we're quite positive on these buildings in the office market, but, and I think, make no mistake, there is going to be a big question, because everyone that's going to be moving to these buildings, and these buildings may be very popular, but they will be vacating other space. And the overall pie of tenants, it's definitely not getting bigger. And as John said, it's getting about 20-30% smaller. So we will see a problem, or we will see older buildings that will very much struggle to attract tenants. And the real question going forward is, what's going to happen with those buildings? And are they going to be redeveloped, or will we see some more creative solutions? Are they going to be renovated? Is there other uses that we could have? And that's really the interesting thing that we will be looking at in the market in the coming years, because that divergence and the difference between the popular buildings and less popular ones is here to stay. So with that, we've got really at the end of our presentation, and I'd like to maybe just summarize the key 3 takeaways of what we've been talking about. So one is, there's clearly employees demand more quality from their workplace and from the office in order to sort of be able to come back to the office. And companies are responding to that in their own interior spaces and in the buildings they seek out. And the market is responding by providing those options to them. Finally, on the rental level, yes, it's much more tenant friendly. It's a much better market right now to search for office than it was a couple of years ago. But we do expect the popular buildings to remain popular and the market overall to remain relatively stable, although there's going to be certain buildings that may no longer be feasible. And finally, and most importantly, it's actually hybrid is here to stay. And the way people implement this is companies are going in completely different directions. Even within industries, we see that. So it's a very complex question. And the real estate solutions that companies use to kind of meet their office demand, whether it's from office space to work to home to co-working, is getting more and more complex. And it's no longer an easy question to answer. How much office space do I need? So this is really the questions that we help a lot of our clients with to answer and to find the right spaces. So if any of you are considering or wondering about this, we are more than happy to help you, and we do look forward to hearing all of your questions. Please feel free to come to us later or reach out to us. Our email addresses are here as well, and I think we can now open up to questions, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. Thank you.
Almost 80% of financial firms in Japan they are experienced what we call it telework. It's a remote work. So they've already implemented the programs, and they don't disclose the status at the moment. So I think we don't see so much difference.
Okay, thank you. And then John, perhaps I could ask you a question. Do you think the Japanese? So I work in tech, and very much whenever we go and speak to companies, they're interested in the hardware rather than the software. So do you see that in Japan that in offices that there's more of an emphasis on the hardware, or is that not the case?
When it comes to fitting out projects in office space in Tokyo, and people may have personal experiences from this, as soon as you start altering infrastructure within buildings, it gets very expensive. The landlords have nominated contractors who basically look after all of the kind of main facility work. So if anything, I think that there's a shift away, as I was referring to before, in terms of flexible spaces where the focus is more on what the tenant can do themselves as opposed to engaging so much with the landlord. And so I guess more software kind of solutions to answer your question. Yeah.
Thank you. Joris, you mentioned a little bit about the changing landscape of the buildings, and you mentioned co-working space. So the other week I went to see CIC. I was very impressed by that whole setup, very collaborative, really interesting space in Torimon Hills. So do you think we'll see a growing trend towards more of those sort of type CIC sort of places where multiple tenants are sharing sort of multiple facilities within buildings?
Yes, definitely. And I think co-working is a big part of the market. About 2% of all grade A office space is co-working. And of course, CIC is one good example. WeWork is actually the biggest player, but there's a couple of other players in the market as well. And we see that especially WeWork had this huge expansion just before COVID, and all those centers, they came online in 2020 basically. And some of them, actually one of them in this building here, 4 or 5 floors, the biggest one they have in Japan and probably even globally. And those centers have very much struggled, and there was a lot of pressure on that market, especially in the earlier days of COVID when people could just quickly get out of those leases. We have seen sort of a stabilization there as well, with companies, especially a few larger Japanese corporates have even put their entire headquarter operations within a huge co-working facility and sort of let their employees then work from anywhere, because it's a very cost-effective way to get sort of a club type of workplace without having to build a kitchen and provide free beer for yourself. So that's definitely, we've seen an uptick there, but overall there's still vacancy rates remain quite high. But given it meets so much of that sort of the amenity aspect, we do see demand in that market going forward as well. But maybe not as much as expansion as there has been.
Okay, thank you. Just one more round then with the panelists. So Rie, again, looking at that map, which Japanese companies do you think are leading the way in the hybrid model, and what are they doing?
Yes, actually, like technology companies like Fujitsu, Hitachi, and NEC, those like major giants in Japan, they have been actually promoting their products with doing hybrid, and especially like Fujitsu, they make the global guideline and persuading all the global employees to move into that like. So and the rest, yeah, some like companies are also doing the hybrid. So those kind of like a unique company, like is trying to lead the model.
Thank you. John, what's the coolest or most innovative design you've seen in a building or in an office in Japan?
That's a good question. We worked on a project for the pharmaceutical company MSD recently. Who are in Kodansha. They've got a large headquarter building there, and it was an interesting project because it started. They wanted to completely transform their workplace, and this was pre-COVID, to activity-based working, and actually also teams-based, sort of flex working. So they were working in groups, so they wanted these flexible environments. What happened midway through the project, the pandemic hit, and so the design had to kind of morph. But the overall, and it did so very well, and the overall outcome looks great. And it was a collaboration between JLL design team and a local design firm called Design, who did that. And it's got a great kind of cafe space, kind of all the latest technology, etc. It looks very cool. Another one recently, actually, we happened to visit, Joris and I last week, was the Salesforce Tower in Marunouchi, which is a fantastic fit out as well. I think all of their kind of headquarter offices around globally are in kind of landmark buildings, and they choose the best buildings with the best views, etc. But yeah, the client areas and things there were amazing, and also the technology was kind of very, very cool.
Thank you. And finally, Joris, you mentioned about all the old stock, the elephant in the room. You said that obviously in the coming years there'll be answers there. What's your personal view on what's going to happen to that old stock?
Yeah, and it's a very good question that I also don't have the full answer to be honest, but it's really interesting to see how that will develop. And I think globally we've seen a couple of office buildings being transformed into apartment buildings, residentials, for which there is still a huge demand in central areas as people kind of spend more time working from home. I think in Japan it will be hard because the floor plates of buildings are just quite large, so you'd get sort of very long, narrow apartments. But I do know that probably the most logical thing what people would typically do here is to tear it down and build sort of a new building. But I personally hope to see maybe we can see more renovations of existing office buildings into something else. And I know that a few developers are looking at that and considering those possibilities. So I think that's where we'll see some very interesting things happening.
So I think I'd like to close down the event today. So before we do so, can we give the panelists a round of applause for their very presentation today?